Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brian, as you know, and this is Structural Anatomy, arms. We're going to be drawing more arms, as you probably guessed, but I'm going to try something a little bit different, right? In the past, every time I've taught like an arm anatomy thing, we always kind of treat the arm as like a standalone thing, right? Like we just draw the arm, and it usually starts right at the shoulder, down to the wrist, and that's what we study, which makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what you generally think of as the arm. But I'm going to try and mix it up a little bit in the sense that arms, they don't start and stop so simply, right? Because we have a lot of stuff coming from the torso connecting to the arm, and vice versa. And the way that that connection happens is important and a major part of what makes arms look right or off, So I'm going to try and draw arms including the section of torso that they connect to, and then I'm going to also try drawing arms in pairs, right? So I'm not going to just draw one arm on a person. We're going to draw both arms on a person. And I tried to pick some reference where that'll be not too difficult, and we don't have too much foreshortening this week. In the coming weeks, we'll get more into cool like foreshortened stuff, but there's a little bit that I'll talk about on here. But for this week, for the most part, I'm going to try and keep it reasonably flat, and then we're going to start with gesture again. I mean, I don't know, I've been teaching this class differently this term, right? Like in the past, I never had a full week devoted to gesture because it seems like a bit much, kind of, and people maybe just don't want to draw two lines for arms over and over for hours. But it's important, like it's really critical, and the way that we do gesture at the school and the way that I do it in particular is really specific, right? In the sense that it really is about length and width and establishing that relationship and that space. And if you're not good at kind of eyeballing that and getting it in place pretty quick, then it gets pretty tough. And so I don't know, I thought it'd be good to spend some time focused on that. So we'll be starting with that, and we'll be drawing these things kind of in pairs. And I'm going to do two people, which will be four arms. If I have time, I'll do a third, but I don't really know because I've never done this demo before. We're going to have basically like a long, wide space for this one because he's like kind of crouched down, but his arms are stretched out pretty far. He's got one stretched out entirely. The other is kind of bent, but outstretched behind him. Normally, this would be a tough pose, but like if I were to be doing this in like a figure drawing class or something, which is kind of why I picked it, because it has really clearly kind of the clavicle, or not clavicle, the scapula and like shoulder connection. So let me block a little head in here. And I'm just going to keep it real light, kind of small. And I need to make sure I have room for the rest of this stuff I want to draw. All right, so his head's going to sit kind of down here, although I don't know why I started with a circle. For a profile head, that was probably a bad move. There we go. That's a better shape. Then, pull the front plane down. And this isn't a head class, right? So you can speed through this part as long as it's proportionally more or less in the right spot. And we can add a neck on there really quick. Neck. And now immediately we start getting down into the shoulder, right? Which I think this is really more kind of where the arm starts. So we have trapezius coming down, and then that hits the acromion process, right? And the acromion process is that part of the scapula that sticks out. It's sitting right kind of back under his chin, kind of right back under here, right? And so that's one of those landmarks we want to look for. If you remember the scapula, it had kind of that knobby thing sticking up off the end, and you can feel that bump on our shoulder. And what's crazy, and I don't know if anybody else has made this mistake, but for literally the first 3 years I was here probably, and every time I heard the instructors talk about the acromion process, I thought they were talking about the end of the clavicle. Like I thought there was like a bump at the end of the clavicle, because that's kind of what it feels like when you feel your shoulder. It goes right up and then there's a bump, but it's not. It's actually on the scapula. And I don't know, everybody right now is probably being like, yeah, duh, that's obvious. But I don't know, for some reason in my mind that just wasn't the way I understood it at first. So looking for these little landmarks is super helpful, right? We have acromion process, and then using our plumb lines, right? Because we have different tools to get things in the right spot. We have plumb lines, negative shapes, angles. kind of using both here, looking for the negative shape between the chin, neck, and shoulder. Also using a plumb line, make sure the acromion process is in the right spot. I think his chin probably needs to come out a little farther. Right, and then we can see if I drew a line straight across here, another plumb line or level line, I guess, I can see the entire other shoulder sits above that line, right? So this trapezius is going to cut over, and then the shoulder is going to pop out. And again, using another plumb line, it's going to sit kind of even with his chin right here, right? So that shoulder is going to pop out here. And also make sure there's not too much trapezius on here. Shoulder pops out about chin level here and then cuts back this way, right? But remember, thinking C curves, S curves, and straights for gesture, nothing else. I mean, it's a combination of those things. I have a little straight, little C curve for the shoulder. I'm going to try and get the spine in here real quick because it's so visible. It'll maybe help keep things lined up. And then it's sort of coming back kind of that direction, right? But we're not going to draw any lower than that. So I would argue that the scapula is part of the arm, in my opinion. If we're going to draw arms, we got to get the scapula on there, right? So we can see his arms coming out. We can literally see the angle of the scapula on there pretty well, right? It looks like it wraps back this way. Again, using a plumb line, comes back almost to all the way where the back of his head is, and then cuts back this direction. Right, and then it sort of cuts down. And we can measure it, see how big it is. I mean, it's basically would go up to about his eye level if we measured it against his head. So that's pretty close. That's about where I have it, I think. And then it'll sort of cut up this way. And it sits basically right back in here. Sorry, it's got all that muscle and stuff attached to it. So it's hard to lock the shape of the bone underneath it down into something really specific without kind of guessing a little bit. Because it's covered up by a bunch of stuff, you know. Okay, it's going to come back this way and then out, kind of that way. But it basically sits right there, right? The other one is sitting kind of locked together with this one a bit, only this arm's getting pushed back. So rhythmically, these two scapula might not line up super well because the arms are doing two very different things. You know, this one we're only seeing like a little sliver of it, kind of sitting in here and coming up kind of high. And sort of cutting back here. And then we're getting just a little bit of it. Right? Because it's like turned, like we're seeing like the edge of it essentially, right? So there would actually be, like if we were drawing it three-dimensionally, we would be seeing like the back plane kind of running along there as it cuts over towards the shoulder. And then depending on what the arms are doing, I frequently try to rhythmically lock the tops of the scapula together. In this case, though, the arms are doing two very different things. So to do that, we would either have to kind of force like a little S curve in here, which you can do, or just let them be not linked rhythmically, which again, you know, depending on how you draw and what you want your drawing to look like, could be what you want. Or maybe not. Maybe you want to push more of those rhythms. Maybe you want to strike more of a balance. Like if you have rhythms everywhere, maybe having one non-rhythmical section, such as the scapula, might be good. I don't know. It just depends. But something to think about, right? In this case, they don't match up necessarily. Okay, so we got to attach the shoulders, right? So we have our scapula. Remember the shoulder attaches up here. It's coming from the other side. We're attaching to the clavicle over on the other side, and then it comes down this way, comes out pretty far, and then remember it also attaches right back about here on the scapula, And then we can see it really clearly on him. I mean, you can really see it coming up here and attaching. It really goes back pretty far. In fact, I feel like the scapula section even comes back farther than I have it. It's more like that. But it attaches right back here, right? And then we can see it kind of cutting down this way. And then wrapping around the arm out here. And then wrapping back that way, right? And we just kind of lock it right on there. And then the other one we already have attached pretty well. It's super kind of activated in a weird position, so it's not clear. But what's happening is this. This part's coming down, and we get just like a little S curve. That kind of locks right in there. But again, with the position that that arm is in, everything's being kind of pushed up and pushed out of whack a little bit. Okay, so now we need our long kind of rhythmical lines, right? Now we're at the point where we were doing, I don't know, we're at the point where we can do what we were doing last week, is what I was trying to say, right? So we need our gesture on here. So we're going to look for our long flowing lines that run from the shoulder down this way, right? C curve. This way, and then rhythmically again from the scapula, right? Because the tricep connects to the scapula, if you remember, kind of right about in here. And his arm's fairly thin, but you don't want to get it too thin. You know, he's lean, but he's in good shape too. I mean, he's healthy. So we got to be really careful with these widths, and it's partly why I chose him, because he's kind of hard to draw, and he's kind of has that long, lanky limb type look, which to get that to work correctly, you just have to be super careful. I mean, everything has to be just right. Look for exactly the right width in here. Remember, because gesture is all about length and width, right? So I'm coming in here and looking for the sweep here, and then the sweep along back this way, right? So just two C curves. And then we got to figure out where the elbow is going to sit. So he's going to sit even with the bottom, maybe about there. I mean, you can kind of measure if you need to. I'm just kind of guessing a little bit real quick. And then from the elbow, remember we have the ulna. That like elbow bone is kind of your ulna, which is really straight and shoots off this direction. And now we're judging angles, right? And I'm saying, okay, what angle is this coming off here at? Trying to drop a straight down in there. And then looking at his hand and saying, okay, his hand sort of connects. Well, his wrist starts about even with his mouth, kind of. So about here. So I don't know. We use that as a quick guide to finish our gesture, right? So now this, our other gesture line, it's going to wrap down this way. But if that works, we should get a good width for the wrist, a good width for the elbow, which is kind of looking all right, I think, right? So this is going to come in and connect up in here, get ulna down in here. Right, tricep, kind of down in here. And then the hand is going to sit right out here. Right, so then we can kind of add the gesture to the other side as well and say, okay, now we know our shoulder comes out this way, walks down here, and then just kind of rhythmically just follow that sweep and judge that angle as best we can. It's going to come out that direction. And then this basically just comes from back behind here because we're not really seeing the connection points from this angle. We're really just kind of looking for a rhythmical sweep back and then trying to figure out where the elbow sits, right, which is going to be kind of back here, maybe even farther. No, that'd be about right. So gesture, right? I know it sounds simple, but it's not as simple as it sounds. I mean, it's something that for whatever reason took me a long time to figure out. So we've got our gesture down, right? Hand sits kind of back here. Right, and then we have this one sitting up here. So now what do we do now, right? Let's figure out how to make them a little bit more three-dimensional, add some depth. This one's fairly flat, right? So we're looking kind of away at this end of it, but then this end we're looking kind of straight at it. And then this arm is kind of bent towards us a little bit. So we have to take all this stuff into consideration. I would usually start with the wrist, right? The wrist is always going to tell me kind of what angle the box of the wrist is sitting at, you know, because our wrist has a very clear top plane, very clear side planes, bottom plane. So usually I can fit a boxy shape for the wrist in here pretty well and pretty quickly, right? So I'm going to just look in here and judge the angle of that box best I can and say, okay, there's the wrist, top of the wrist, side plane, and then we have a straight back to the elbow, right? Because that's the ulna. So that locks in right there. And then the wrist is pronated, right? Because the thumb is on this side, right? Thumb's kind of sitting back over here. So we know that the wrist is pronated, which means then the brachioradialis, which remember connects kind of right up in here along the bone, is going to go from here to the thumb side of the wrist. You know, that's going to be different in change depending on the wrist rotation. You know, so it's something we really need to keep track of. So then we're going to come in and just kind of start breaking it down a little bit more, right? Like we're kind of looking away at this side just a little bit. We're seeing kind of some of the boxiness of the elbow in here a little bit, I think. Right, so we can get a little bit of the corner of the elbow in there because his arm's like maybe rotated away from us just slightly. We can get it's probably good. Let's go back and look at this one real quick just for some key landmarks again. Right, so our landmarks now are going to be the shoulder, which needs to wrap up and over this section a bit more. Right, because this is overlapping this. This comes over. Back like that, and then this comes out from under there. Okay, so now we're seeing the inside of the elbow, right? So what's going on with the elbow here? We have, again, the ulna kind of sticking out a bit. And then we're seeing the pinky side of the hand right here, which means the ulna just comes straight down from here to here. Right, so that's just going to be a straight, drop straight down. And then again, we get the boxy shape of the wrist. So we got to look and be really careful with selecting this box. right? So it's going to sit in there like that. It starts getting a little bit more three-dimensional. Right, get some of that wrist shape in there. This arm's kind of leaned back towards us a bit, so we're actually looking down and into this section a bit. So we can kind of check how those contour lines are wrapping around here. So it's coming back towards us a little bit. Same thing on this side. It was ever so slightly, I think we're looking at it this way. And this part up here is like almost like straight on. You know, but this one's so flat that we're not seeing much. So once we get kind of our, oh wait, there's one more landmark, right? The inside of the elbow we're seeing, which I'm just going to put a little circle there. But remember, this is the humerus, like the pointy part of the humerus, the epicondyle that sticks out on the inside of your elbow. And that's important because all the flexors are going to attach to that point, you know, and basically like block on here, kind of. Okay, so I think that's enough landmark. Oh, nope, let's get this one too. This epicondyle is also important. Sits like right there, right? So that kind of creates the hinge of the joint, right? So if we were to think of this more three-dimensionally, we get literally like a little boxy shape kind of coming back towards us. That's going to come up and lock on there for that elbow. And then there's literally like this, another box sticking out here a little bit. You know, which is the rest of that bone, which would be coming back up this direction. And so then we have this part, right, rotating around that part, which is kind of what's going on underneath the surface. So we need to get this gesture down in a way that allows for all this stuff to get aligned correctly. Okay, so then next level of information, right? We'll come in and probably move back over to this one, look for the bicep, which in this case, going to come from behind the deltoid right here, which is coming down and sort of wrapping, locking onto the bone, wrapping back that way. Now we got to think about all that anatomy that we did and start thinking in terms of overlaps and how to create a little bit of depth. I like the shape of this shoulder. Try this again. Comes out. Down a little bit lower. There we go. Okay, then bicep, right? Kind of pops out of here, cuts down, and then we get a little ramp down, and then it sort of like drops and turns into tendon, right? Because you remember at the end of the bicep, it turns into tendon. So it'll drop a little bit, and then we get a little bit of a straight right in there. Just a little bit. And then we have, remember, the brachioradialis, which if you recall, attaches to the humerus, but it kind of cradles right down in that epicondyle part, right? So if we can see that part of the humerus sticking out here, that bump on the outside of the elbow, and we can see where the ulna is, then we know this muscle is going to wrap kind of right up around here and lock onto this bone, right? Remember, the bone's kind of going from here down to here. So this is going to lock right up on here. You know, and then it's going to come wrap out this direction. Right, so we add that brachioradialis on there. Now, I'm not going to go super in-depth anatomically, right? I just want to get the key stuff on here and mostly talk about the relationship between the gesture and the actual anatomy, you know, and kind of how that relates to these big three-dimensional forms. Okay, so remember then on the bottom here, we can see some of the flexors kind of draping down below the ulna, right? So now what angle are those at? Those are going to kind of drop down this way. Right, we're not seeing a lot of them, but they drop down here and then sort of disappear back behind here. Right, get our elbow on there. Now, flexors, we're not going to go into each and every flexor. We're going to think of them as a group for today. Maybe, I don't know, if we have time in the coming weeks, I'll go into it more. But they basically just sit here as a group, right? They connect, again, to that same kind of bump. If you want to get really technical, there's one that kind of wraps around this bone a little bit as well, you know, and then like kind of one or two that kind of come off that bump. But usually you can just kind of group them and just be like, okay, there's flexor group here. Unless you're drawing like a big bodybuilder, hulked out person, then you're probably gonna have to draw them. But that's fine for now. I think that's okay. Make this wrist a little bit wider. Okay, tricep, right? We need to get that on there. So that's locking onto the scapula. Sort of comes down and then back around that way. It sort of locks right in there. Really, there's not like a ton of definition to the contour on this part. Right, so then the definition that is in there is really more coming from inside the contour. You know, there's probably some of the brachialis kind of right about in there. But again, we don't need to go too in-depth into this. What I want to see really from you guys this week is the gesture and then adding this little bit of structure on top of it, right? So let's look at this side real quick. We'll come over and start looking at like how to add this tricep on here a little bit better. Right, so again, making sure this overlap is working correctly. We have this part popping out of here. Because remember, overlap is a huge part of creating depth. And understanding anatomically what overlaps what from certain angles is really critical. So understanding that, okay, now the tricep is going to come out from under the shoulder, right? So that's an important overlap to show this overlaps this, you know, and then connects down into here. Drops down this direction. And then sort of locks right into the elbow. Kind of sits right on there. And then from underneath here, we probably get some overlap. Tricep kind of coming up this way. Coming up that way, and then we get some of the bicep hanging down here. And I don't know, well, we probably would see a little bit of tendon maybe. Right, get a little bit of that straight on there. Again, for that little bit of tendon down at the end of the bicep. And then we have flexors, right, attaching onto here. And then recall we have one that sort of pokes out. And so, well, actually these would be extensors probably because they're on the other side. Right, so we get extensor group, flexor group, and then we're seeing a little bit of the brachioradialis kind of pass by the other side as it makes its way down from the thumb, but we're only seeing a little bit of it. Right, sort of coming down, dropping past here. And this is wrapping back this direction. Right, so keep in mind this is coming back towards us quite a bit. Also, I think this got a little thin. I'm going to crank this up a little bit. Okay, remember this part's coming back towards us. Get this shoulder on here. This is the level I think you guys should bring these up to this week. And then in the coming weeks, we can do more if we are so inclined, which we will be. Okay, so that's kind of sitting on there. And then we can come back to this one real quick and maybe, oh, you know what else I forgot is the rest of the scapula stuff, right? Because we have that infraspinatus sitting up here and then teres major and minor kind of down here. And again, we don't have to go super in depth, but we need to show a couple key overlaps, right? Which is the overlap between the tricep and teres major, right, which is coming down and locking on here. And then we get infraspinatus popping out here. Sort of locking back this way. And we probably aren't seeing much of teres minor. It rarely shows up a lot. It's something that you just see a little bits of here and there. Right? And then if you really want to get technical, we can throw the lat in there as well. It's kind of also an arm muscle, which sounds weird, but it's true. So we're coming down that way. And then we're seeing his chest. Okay. So I think that's enough for that one. This is what we should focus on this week. And then again, in the coming weeks, we can do more stuff. So let's pick the next one. About, halfway through. So that seems about right. Next one is going to be tough. I picked a number of these, but I included one that has like some good foreshortening in the forearm. But it still has two mostly elongated, very gestural limbs, but then it has kind of a tricky forearm. So let's add this one on here. I'm going to put this one probably down in like this section. I don't know how it's going to fit, but we have one arm that comes up really high. The whole gesture sort of comes down like this. It'll fit kind of like that maybe. It's going to be going the wrong way. It'll fit like that. Okay, which means her head then is going to have to go about here. And remember, we're trying to lock these things together and figure out how these arms work in conjunction with one another. So head shape. Right here. Here, side of her head drops down. Then we connect up the jaw. All right, so we have the shape of her head. Neck is going to drop down this way and this way. Trapezius Oh, wait, hang on. Neck needs to come down farther and be a little bit wider, I think. Right, and then our trapezius. We'll start about down here. Same thing on this side. It's about here. Again, we don't need to do too much head stuff. It's not a head class. We just need to at least figure out where the clavicle is going to sit, right? And now we kind of know, okay, here's the pit of the neck. And clavicle, as much as it is a torso bone, I think it's also an arm bone. So we'll start with the clavicle, right? And then we have it kind of wrapping up this way, off that direction, because she has her arm raised way up. And then this one's sort of just shooting off that direction, right? So we'll come in here and add the chromium process. See right there. This chromium process is kind of buried because her arm's raised way up. But now we're, it didn't take much, and we're in arm territory now, right? So we're coming in here looking for the rest of this shoulder, which if her trapezius comes over and connects to her clavicle right there, then her shoulder pops up from behind here. Right here, we need to make sure we get that little negative shape right in here between the shoulder and the neck, right? Remember plumb lines, negative shapes, and angles. Very important, especially for gesture and getting things placed. Shoulder is going to come off this way. This clavicle disappears up under the shoulder. And then it's going to wrap down around the arm, and then it turns into pectoralis right about there. And then if we kept going, the breast would sit kind of down here. Okay, so the shoulder on this side, right, it's going to sit fairly level across the traps. Then we get shoulder poking out here. Feels a little long for some reason. Move the acromion process in a little bit. All right, let's try this again. Shoulder coming out here and then sort of dropping down that way. Right, so remember, if the clavicle is here, then the shoulder connects right about there, right, on the clavicle. And I can see it comes down to about here. So rhythmically, we just need to connect those two spots, which will probably most likely be with an S curve, which will curve in and over. Same thing here. There's actually a little S-curve-like connection in here as well. We just have most of the shoulder wrapping around the other side where we can't see it. Okay, so back to gesture, right? We got to the shoulders. Now we're going to come in and look for nice rhythmical gesture, which in this case is going to be a C curve. Wrapping down this way. Oh, a little bit of a center line in here too. Off that way. Also, it might be a good idea to get a little bit of the pec in here, because that's kind of helpful, super helpful with arm placement as well. Right, so the pectoralis would sit right about there. And then that'll help us figure out where this arm attachment goes, right? Because from under there comes that coracobrachialis. Sort of pops out this way. And then we get the tricep coming from under there. And then that, again, brings us to the start of the gesture. Gesture is going to swoop down. Remember, really keeping track of the width of the arm right here. Comes down to where about the elbow is, and then shoots off this direction. Hand will sit right about in there. So again, long flowing lines, right? C curves, S curves, straights. I'm going to make it a little bit thinner. I'm going to do it by bringing this side in because I feel like that shoulder is still a little bit big. So I'm going to bring this side down a little bit. See if I can get this to, yeah, there we go, to a width that feels good. Remember, length and width. Training our brain to identify the lengths and widths of things really quickly and efficiently is important. So remember, we have her wrist pronated, which means this arm's going to sit in there. And then we'll come up and do the gesture on this one real quick. So same type of deal. Probably put like a C curve first. And using a plumb line, I can see that her hand sits just to this side of the shoulder and like about up here. Somewhere along there. So we're going to have to connect these, right, with a C curve. For that gesture, it's going to sit right in here. And then we get, again, we're seeing like a little bit of the armpit, like the lat. And looking for that length and width again, right? So it's going to come out this way and then back. Again, using plumb lines, right? So her elbow, I can see, sits almost even with her forehead, maybe just above it, which is about there. So I feel like the elbow is going to sit right about here. Cut back this way. And again, her wrist is pronated, so it's looking pretty thin up here. Not quite this thin. I'm going to make it a little bit wider. There we go. That feels pretty good. So that seems like a good gesture now. All right, so our hand's going to sit up here. So let's figure out kind of what's going on three-dimensionally again, right? So we got to start thinking more in terms of structure now, right? Because that's kind of our three steps, right? Gesture, structure, mass. So what's going on structurally, which includes anatomy, right? But I'm going to start more just thinking in terms of cylinders and boxes. So this arm's coming towards us a bit. So I know it's equivalent to a cylinder literally coming out towards us. Right? And trying to figure out how to take that same idea and sort of inject it back into here in a way that accurately reflects what's going on with the arm. Right? Let me get this part coming out. And keep this stuff light. I mean, I know I'm drawing it dark, but that's kind of so you guys can see. More of a boxy shape to the elbow. Sometimes. It depends on the angle you look at it from. But then the wrist right here is going to be really tricky, right? We have to be careful because we're getting into that pronated wrist again. So remember, I mentioned the boxy shape of the wrist. So we're going to come in and find that. Right? That's sitting up here and here. Right? It's coming out towards us. Right? Boxy shape of the wrist. But then, remember, this wrist is pronated. So we get something interesting on this one. Because if you recall from the pronation, the radius attaches to the outside of the elbow. So rather than this bone dropping straight down, this is actually the radius now. So this bone is actually going to cut back kind of this direction, back towards this other side of the elbow where it connects. Right? It's going to go that direction. And then from underneath there, well, we can attach the hand, I guess, real quick too. Might be good. Find wrist shape. And then also, this whole section's coming towards us quite a bit, right? It's pretty foreshortened. Plus pronation. See if we can get the hand on here. Again, we don't have to do too much hand stuff. Just let it sit there for now. Okay, but my point is we get bone going this way, and then we get tendon dropping and muscle dropping underneath here and connecting back up onto this bone. Right? And then we still get, from this angle, we're not seeing the ulna, right? Like the main part of the elbow that we think of, but we are seeing the epicondyle of the humerus, right? Which is dropping down here, and we're seeing that epicondyle right about in here. And if you recall, that's where our flexors connect, which means that's where all this muscle down here is going to connect to, is that little epicondyle right there, right? And then we get the biceps, right? Cutting down this way, out from under the shoulder, right? It sort of cuts out. Down, and then tendon-wise sort of locks in here, right? And connects down to the forearm bone section. And recall we have pectoralis up in here. Again, looking for some of that boxy shape as it locks up into the body, right? We want to give it some three-dimensional form. And then we start looking for some overlaps again, right? So we have bicep kind of cutting down this way, and then that like kind of coracobrachialis kind of cutting over that way. And then we get the tricep then dropping down here. Right, tricep drops down there and then just disappears back behind this epicondyle right there. So not bad. All we're missing now is that brachioradialis, right? Remember, that goes from the outside of the arm, which we're not seeing here, so that means it's going to come from back behind this bicep, right? It's going to have to come out from here. And then remember, it's going to come and connect to the thumb side of the wrist, right? So it's going to connect kind of to here. So we got to think about how that's coming out. It's then cutting down. And then sort of off this way, right? But then we also get the other kind of top plane of the bone that's showing right here. Too bony. There's usually a little rhythm that'll sit in the down in the forearm itself, where they'll kind of lock together with this kind of shape. And sometimes pushing that shape back in there will help me realize that things are either connected correctly or not. In this case, I think they needed to adjust a little bit, right? I think we needed actually a little bit more brachioradialis kind of wrapping up around there. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, I know that's complicated, but the reason this is good to know is because if you see the shadow pattern in here, if you look at the reference, the shadow pattern that sits in there looks like this, right? It does this, and then it sort of cuts back a little bit, and then it cuts down around this forearm part, right? And the reason for that is because of the wrist pronation, right? So if we don't kind of understand how that works, then we're not going to know when to like inject it back into there or when that's necessary. So it makes a very specific shape, and if the wrist wasn't pronated, right, if we were looking at it from the other side, that shadow pattern would literally just run straight down the bone across the ulna right there, you know, on the other side. So again, that's important to know. And then we'll go back up and do this one real quick and look for same type of stuff, right? So again, thinking about the wrist and the elbow, right, which kind of has our bony landmarks in there. So what's going on with the wrist? Again, we have it pronated. So we're going to get wrist shapes. Kind of coming back that way. And then we'll get kind of some like tendinous connection up in here. Right, so there's tendon kind of feeding back this way. Might need to be a little bigger. And kind of out that way, right? And then remember, we're seeing a little bit of the ulna now, sticking right out here. So that's going to be a straight, remember, from pinky side of the hand, which is here, down to the ulna. So we have to push a straight in there. And we have to use that straight to make sure the rest of these gesture lines work, because that straight has to be in there. And so I kind of design everything else around that a little bit once I get it in place. And then we're looking kind of down a little bit at these sections. Section I feel like it's actually going away from us a little bit. We're looking up at it. So it's trying to give me a direction, an idea of what direction things are going, you know, real generally. So then we have, let's see, this kind of rhythm that can fit in here. Remember, I did that on the last one too. And that's kind of wrapping down around the epicondyle, up under the bicep, and then around the other side. Kind of locking on there like that. And then that kind of just helps things lock together more three-dimensionally. And another way of kind of checking your work too. Okay, so we have bicep coming out from here, right? So it's going to shoot out this way, and connects down a little bit, and then again we get a little bit of a straight for the tendon, right? It's probably a bit dramatic right now. Okay, shoulder, bicep, and then remember we have a little bit of the lat and then the tricep coming out from behind there is going to come out here and then sort of just loop around this way. Right, and then we get that ulna sticking out. Tricep comes from behind there. And then we're seeing flexors, right? So we get flexors on the bottom. Coming out this way. Not quite that much. And sort of attaching straight down. Those aren't lining up quite right though. Try this again. This needs to attach directly to that ulna. So it needs to come up and then over. There we go. So sometimes if you get stuck, reverse engineering things a little bit can kind of help. And then we need that brachioradialis again, right? So where is it going? It's wrapping around and connecting to the other side of the arm, but then it's also connecting to the thumb side of the wrist, which is right here. Right, so we have that connection point, and then it's coming from behind here. You know, so how do we match those things up? Well, it's got to come out here, back down this direction, and then cut back across there. Now we just got to make sure this isn't bent too far. Right, it comes directly from the wrist. You know, again, there's a big flexor section, kind of attaching here. And then that brachioradialis coming up. But then that's going and just disappearing around the other side. Right, and then bicep sort of comes out from under there. Remember, you can kind of get that little rhythm that'll loop on there. And then we have, hang on, we're seeing, I sort of combine two things a little bit. We have like the epicondyle sitting about here, right? And then we're seeing like just a little bit of the ulna poke out from behind it, I think. Should be like kind of buried up underneath there. Bad thumb. Handle sit right about there. So that's pretty much my thinking, right? I mean, that's what we're, at least what I'm trying to go for most of the time. This head got a little bit small. Okay, what time is it? An hour. Let's do just one more quick arm. One other thing I want to talk about. We'll do this one from the back. That'll fit on here pretty well. Actually, no, we'll do it on a separate page. So, I mean, for your guys' assignment, I would recommend just going through all these arms and trying to do this with each of them and see if you can kind of understand this whole process and breakdown, Okay, so here we're looking at this one from the back. This is the one where he's like crouched and we're seeing him from like a 3/4 back view kind of. He's got his hand on his knee. Again, starting with the head. Kind of drop back down around this way. Neck. And then his shoulder sort of overlaps a lot of this stuff, right? Kind of in here. And then we get his acromion process, like right here. Sort of locks on there. We're seeing really like a little flat top plane here. For like the top of the trapezius, and then we get the shoulder kind of attaching onto here. And then we want that gesture now wrapping down this way. Right, and then we need the scapula, which is dropping back here. And sort of connecting. Back up that way. And remember, that's important because we need to know where the tricep attaches to that scapula, because it has to attach to that bone somewhere in order for this arm to be connected. Right, so that's going to swoop down, and then drop down this direction, and then we get a straight going down this way. Again, remember, length and width is critical. I'm being really careful here. What's the width here? What's the width of the elbow? What's the width of the wrist? Now, what is the wrist doing? It's going away from us. We're seeing the side of the wrist a little bit, kind of right here. Right, so we want to place the wrist, find the boxy shape of the wrist, and then real generally and real kind of quickly, think about, are we looking up at something? Are we looking down at it? What's the kind of three-dimensional roundness or boxiness of it? How's that sitting in there? I feel like we're kind of looking maybe up at this section a little bit and then down at this section that's going away from us quite a bit. Right, so you can see just with those few lines, we add a whole bunch of dimensionality to it. But now we can come in here and lighten this a bit. Good to get a hand on here too. Okay, so again, thinking about our landmarks, right? Got our wrist, got our shoulder, we need to get the elbow on there. Now the elbow's at a different angle, right? The other ones I chose angles where it was kind of easy to find the elbow. This one's not so easy. This one, it's like angled in a way where the ulna is like kind of in the middle right here, right? Like that part of the elbow is like here, so we can't put like a real, I don't know, like there's not like an obvious straight line in here. We're going to have to kind of force that a bit and figure out how to make it work. But remember, if the ulna is here, then it's wrapping around that part of the humerus, which means we have the epicondyle of the humerus poking out here. Right? And then ulna sitting here. If you want, we can literally draw it in here as like this box. that kind of sits on here, right? And then it sort of like rotates around this section, right? So then we have the other epicondyle, right? So this wraps all the way through, and the other one sits here, right? So you can kind of start seeing how that hinge works, really, because this part is going to rotate around that part. We can add this straight in here now for that bone. It's going to wrap down here to this wrist, right? Sit right in there. And then we start just kind of wrapping things around and connecting things, right? So if the humerus is cutting up this direction, then we know the shoulder, deltoid's going to come out from this side, cut down a little bit, out again, and then come down and connect to the humerus right in there. And then remember, we got our scapula back up here. So there's going to be kind of an S curve going from here back up to where it connects to the scapula, which is going to be probably about up here. So assuming we get all our building blocks in the right place, then it almost becomes just like a little, I don't know, just exercise in just connecting the pieces together, right? Like, there's not a ton more to it at that point other than knowing what the pieces are, which is kind of the tough part. Okay, so deltoid locks on here. I'm going to make the bicep come from behind it a little bit. All right, it's going to come out and then sort of cut down like that. But then remember, it's going to be disappearing back behind the brachioradialis, which is going to be connecting up along here. And then our tricep, of course, is connecting here and cutting down this direction, and then it turns kind of this way. And remember, that tricep comes down and locks onto the ulna right there. Right, then we get bone sticking out. So remember, brachioradialis now sits kind of in the cradle of that part of the bone. Remember, because the bottom of the bone has that kind of three-dimensional shape to it. If we could see it in there, it would be sitting kind of like this, like that kind of shape, right? And it locks into this section, like right in there. So we're going from here, connecting up around this bone a little bit. And then from here, it's kind of cutting down, out. And then wrapping down this way. And we get some overlap in here. And I can tell right now immediately that this forearm was way too long. It's way more foreshortened than that. We're going to bring that wrist up to like here. Also, this got to be a bit large. Probably play that down a bit. Okay, wrist will sit about there. We'll move this whole hand because it's in the wrong spot. Don't be afraid to change stuff, right? Part of the reason that we want to get used to drawing with really simple lines, at least for a lay-in and like a construction type drawing, we want to use the fewest lines possible and the most simple descriptions possible, simply because then when it comes time to move something or change something that you did wrong, then you'll be less hesitant to make that change. Because there's been a ton of times that I've put something in the wrong spot, and then I tend to move things around it to try to get it to work because I spent a lot of time on it and I don't want to erase it. And I started realizing that if we can keep the lay-in more simple, right, just between C curves, S curves, and straights in that kind of situation or stuff, then makes corrections way, way easier. Like a lot easier. And you won't be like, oh man, I got to do it all over again. You know, instead it's like, whatever, you just erase it and draw a new arm. It takes like 2 seconds because it's made of 3 lines. You know, it's not a big deal. Okay, so then we just need our flexors, right? Which are going to connect, of course, up to this epicondyle. Drop right down in here. Right, they're going to come down here. And then disappear back behind this bone. Just coming out this way. Boxy shape. Remember, we're still looking down at this part a lot. This part, less so. Elbow shape on there, and then I'll just adjust this hand shape again because, well, for obvious reasons, in the wrong spot. A little better. So that's pretty much that. Again, for your guys' like assignment, you know, for full participation people, I would recommend going through all of these and just trying to draw the arms, but include the scapula and the clavicle, right? And maybe a little bit of the pectoralis if you need to, because on some of these I think you'll need a little bit of the pec to make the whole thing work. But just remember, it's not just about the arm, right? It's about how all this stuff connects and works with the stuff around it, you know? And then if you want to keep going, you can add, of course, some overlaps and stuff up in here. Cool. That's pretty much it. So that's it for this week. And, you know, the following week, we'll take it even farther. So I look forward to seeing what you guys draw and doing some more critiques. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.